Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
The Book of Esther, in many ways, is a book about identity, religious identity, political identity, geographic identity, diasporic identity, and familial identity. It's also, at its core, a narrative about the deeply human encounter with a fractured individual identity and one woman's own personal transformation. While the book is named for her, for much of the narrative, Esther is merely a pawn in the game of the men in her life. We see this in a number of ways, particularly through the way she's referred to and described by the narrator. It is telling that our first introduction to Esther in the book is actually through Mordechai. Let's have a look together at the first 7 verses, the psukim of the second chapter of Perek Bet, and unpack together Esther's introduction and the reader's initial impression of her. אחר הדברים האלה כשוך חמת המלך אחשוורוש זכר את ושתי ואת אשר עשתה ואת אשר נגזר עליה. ויאמרו נערי המלך משרתיו ויבקשו למלך נערות בתולות טובות מראה. Sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty." ויפקד המלך פקידים בכל מדינות מלכותו, ויקבצו את כל נערה בתולה טובת מראה אל שושן הבירה, אל בית הנשים, אל יד הגיא סריס המלך, שומר הנשים, ונתון תמרוקיהן. והנערה אשר תיטב בעיני המלך תמלוך תחת ושתי, ויטב הדבר בעיני המלך ויעש כן. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Hegai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics, and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti. The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira, ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish, ish Yemini, asher hagla miYerushalayim, im hagula asher haglata im Yechanya melech Yehuda, asher hagla Nebuchadnezzar melech Babel. In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Yechoniah of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Vayhi omen et Hadassah, hi Esther, bat dodo, ki ein la av va'em, v'hana'ara yifat to'ar v'tovat mar'eh, ubemot aviha v'ima, lekacha Mordechai lo levat. He was foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. The introduction here is significant in that it frames the reader's initial impression of Esther and her role and importance in the story as being secondary to Mordechai. He is introduced first, together with his family lineage, his personal history, and his geographic narrative. And only then comes our introduction to Esther, a secondary character. Mordechai's foster or adopted daughter, she is tied entirely to his identity. In fact, even her physical description in verse 7, V'hana'ara yifat toar v'tovat mar'eh, the maiden was shapely and beautiful, is oddly placed between 2 facts related to Esther's familial status. This information about her beauty is the kind that is often given when female characters are introduced, but we'd likely expect it to be given in relation to Esther's entrance into the harem, not as part of her lineage and her life story. The fact that it's included here sets the tone for her identity as being one that is shaped and molded by and through others. From our very first snapshot of her, we don't get the sense that this is a woman with her own personal identity. She is merely an extension of others. Additionally, like the other biblical characters with a diaspora identity, Joseph and Daniel, Esther has 2 names, her Hebrew one, Hadassah, and her Persian one, Esther. Hadassah meaning myrtle, Esther, either a Babylonian name deriving from the goddess Ishtar or a Persian name from the word stara meaning star. Yet unlike Joseph and Daniel, whose alternate names we found out subsequent to their initial introduction in later narratives, Esther is introduced to us from the outset with both of her names. She emerges on the scene with a complex and multi-layered identity. She's an individual who from the outset can be said to have a double identity and even perhaps dual loyalties. And it's through the deliberate choice of names, titles, and descriptive terms used for Esther throughout the Megillah that the narrator highlights the shifting nature of her identity. It is one that is constantly in flux. When is she Esther HaMalka, Esther the Queen? When is she Esther HaMalka Bat Avichail, Esther the Queen, daughter of Avichail? And when is she simply just Esther? When is she Hadassah? It is interesting to note that for most of the narrative, she's referred to as Esther or Esther HaMalka. And only at the end of the Megillah, in chapter 9, verse 29, is she referred to as Esther HaMalka Bat Avichail, a compounded identity. Throughout her time in the palace, she grows into the role of quintessential Persian queen. And only at the very end, when she assumes a leadership position for the Jewish community, does she reclaim, to some extent, her Jewish identity. But note, she is still Esther. She is not Hadassah. Apart from the first time we meet her, she is never again referred to by her Hebrew name. And so the complexity of her identity is blurred throughout. But alongside this identity in flux also comes Esther's development, both as an individual and as a leader. The Esther that we find in Perek Bet, the second chapter, is passive, obedient, and subservient to Mordechai's direction. In chapter 2, verse 10, she doesn't reveal her origins simply because Mordechai told her not to. In verse 16, when Esther is selected at the culmination of the beauty pageant, the text tells us Vatzilakach, that she was taken, in the passive form, stressing her objectification. We do not know who she is, what she wants, or how she feels. She's a young girl, presumably nervous and frightened, yet we're not given the insider's perspective of what is going on in her heart and her mind, how she feels, and what she wishes. She's mobilized and directed entirely by Mordechai and taken entirely by Achashverosh. In chapter 4, however, she starts to develop and grow, becoming more active, taking charge, and ultimately issuing commands to Mordechai himself. In verse 10, she commands. In verse 17, he listens to the commands. The text says, Ve'avor Mordechai vayas kechol asher tzivta alav Esther. Mordechai goes about the city and did just as Esther commanded him. By the time the edict against the Jewish people is issued, 5 years have elapsed since she has become queen and she has internalized a different set of character traits. Her identity takes shape and she's mobilized to act. At this point in the narrative, Mordechai tells her to shed her dignity, reveal her identity, and beg Achashverosh for mercy. Esther, however, knowing exactly what Achashverosh will respond to, does not follow this course of action. She does not shed her dignity or identity, and instead presents herself to the king, Beketer Malchut, in her crown of royalty, embodying that part of her identity, the majestic. Just as Mordechai refers to her royal position earlier in the narrative, so Esther puts on her malchut, so to speak, when she carries out the plan. She will not go to the king as a seductress, but rather as a dignified woman of high royal stature, embracing that part of who she is. Throughout chapter 5, she shows her cleverness and courage even more than before. At the risk of her life, she goes unsummoned to the king. She stands at the threshold, a liminal position, not quite in, not quite out, but waiting in this uncertain space until she's called in by her husband. If she were not sure that she belonged in the palace, this is the moment when she knows that she does. Achashverosh now beckons her in and her identity is transformed. While in chapter 4, she devises the strategy to gain access to the king, in chapter 5, she goes further, engineering the circumstances under which she will make her plea. None of this is mentioned in Mordechai's instructions. It was Esther alone who planned the party and invited the guests. In the end, then, she becomes a bold risk taker, taking charge and developing into herself. She understands which aspects of her identity and of herself she needs to embrace to get the job done, and she wears those in her interactions with the king. Nevertheless, even at this point, she is still simply navigating what others want from her. Should she do what Mordechai wants or be the person Achashverosh wants her to be? We're ultimately left with the question of who really is Esther? What does she think? What does she want? How does she feel? Is her behavior authentic? To what extent is she putting on a show? And the reader never does actually find out. And it raises a number of larger questions for us to ponder. What does it all mean for us, for the reader, for those who look to Esther as a model for leadership? And we're left to think about the question of who shapes us? To what extent are we shaped by what others demand and expect of us, what they push us to do? And who might that other be? The other could be another person, such as Mordechai, or the other could be God, right? A force beyond our sense of control. According to the medieval commentator, Nachmanides, the Ramban, this very idea is the purpose of a test, of a nisayon. It is meant lahutzi min hakoach el hapoal, to actualize our potential, to develop what is latent within and become the best versions of ourselves. And perhaps maybe this is the biblical idea of a character. Character is not stable, not predetermined. Instead, people change, develop, evolve, and become the great people that we read about, like Esther.